Shalom, and welcome to a talk by Fred Rosenbaum on Shadow of the Day. Fred Rosenbaum is our scholar in residence, and he's an award-winning Jewish historian and educator. In 1974, he founded Lehrhaus Judaica, Northern California's premier school for adult Jewish studies. He led it for over 40 years. He also has taught at a variety of universities in the Bay Area. He has written 4 books on Jewish history, including the very, very good book, Cosmopolitans, and has co-authored 4 memoirs of Holocaust survivors. As a traveling scholar, he has led 25 study tours throughout the world. It is our great pleasure to introduce Fred Rosenbaum speaking on the shadow of the day. Thank you, Fred.
Hey, thank you, Riva, for that introduction, and thank you, Claire and Neely, for helping on the tech side. Really appreciate it. So because this is a recording, we are not going to have any Q&A, obviously, but I do want to hear from you, and my email is right below my image. So please, any comments, any questions, email me, and I will get back to you. Shadow of the Day is not, strictly speaking, a Holocaust film. There are no Germans, no mass shootings, no deportation to death camps. These horrors did take place in Italy. They lost almost 10,000 Jews in the Shoah, most gassed to death in Auschwitz. That's almost 20% of the small pre-war Jewish community of about 50,000. But only beginning in 1943, after Mussolini fell from power and the Nazis occupied Italy, and they perpetrated these unspeakable crimes. The movie takes place well before that. Between 1938 and 1940, when Il Duce is master in his own house. It's in this pivotal 2-year period that he cements his alliance with Nazi Germany, issues anti-Semitic decrees known as the racial laws, and finally enters the war 9 months after it started. The film is about the terrible toll taken on people's lives by that fascist regime that had come to power 16 years earlier in 1922. It soon dismantled democracy, and even before joining the Axis, Mussolini plunged his country into needless, catastrophic wars in Ethiopia, Libya, and Albania. The main character is restaurant manager Luciano. And Luciano is a fundamentally decent person, but he was a supporter of fascism. Beginning in 1938, while he still praises some aspects of it, he grows increasingly disillusioned and disgusted by its zealotry and cruelty, especially as he witnesses the distress of his beautiful young employee, the secret Jew Anna, with whom he gradually falls in love. This journey of Luciano, first being sucked in by the promises of an ultra-nationalist rabble-rouser, and then realizing the calamity this dictator has caused. This trajectory has worldwide resonance today. Ironically, the film was released on February 24th, 2022, the day Russia invaded Ukraine, another example of a raving despot launching an unjust war for territorial gain. Let's look at the first slide, please. The veteran director Giuseppe Piccioni, who also wrote the screenplay, has long been absorbed by this question of people living under tyranny. He grew up in a country still reeling from the war and almost a quarter of a century of fascism. And he worked on the script while Italy was ruled by the most autocratic and bombastic prime minister since Mussolini, the oligarch Silvio Berlusconi, who praised Il Duce in many of his speeches. Piccioni sets his story almost entirely in his hometown of Ascoli Piceno in east central Italy near the Adriatic coast. A unique place because it was largely built with travertine, a natural stone quarried nearby, similar to marble. That's why you see the piazza, which is so vital here in reflecting the local fascist culture. The piazza appears to glow. Okay, we can remove that slide. Thank you. Luciano brings to mind the 1942 classic film Casablanca, in which the shrewd nightclub owner Rick Blaine, played by Humphrey Bogart, outwits the Nazis and the Vichy French to spirit to safety his lover and her husband, a resistance fighter. Rick Blaine, though, is an American expatriate, whereas Luciano, a native Italian, has to grapple with his country's, indeed his own, slide into a police state. So we learn much about both the appeal of fascism and the torment it brought. But first, what is fascism? It's a word often applied to contemporary rulers, from Latin American dictators to East European autocrats to Muslim theocrats. It's thrown around in our own country. How many times have you heard Trump called a fascist? Or Trump called someone else a fascist? The term is pinned on so many different kinds of leaders and loaded with so much emotional baggage that it's become a curse word more than a descriptive. So I hesitate to use it for post-war regimes, evil though they may be. Even the strongmen who came to power in the 1920s and 30s, who are commonly grouped together as fascists, Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco, they differed markedly in their ideologies and actions. But we can certainly use this F word for Mussolini's movement, which called itself fascist. That was their insignia, fasces, a bound bundle of wooden rods, including an axe with its blade emerging. This was a symbol of authority in ancient Rome. The first regime to be known as fascist was never quite replicated, as I've just said. But there are many parallels, many echoes of Italian fascism that have arisen ever since. As the saying goes, history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. So it's disturbing that many of the characteristics of Mussolini's dictatorship will sound familiar to us, whatever name we give later variations. The cult-like hero worship of a demagogue who panders to people's fears and resentments. The yearning to return to a mythologized past. The scapegoating and victimization of minority groups. The suppression of dissent and scorn for intellectuals. The militarism and unprovoked invasions. The ruthless secret police and private militia. All of this can be found from Mussolini to the present day. Now, such regimes in interwar Europe cannot be understood without the background of World War I, a cataclysm that brought down 4 huge empires, caused 20 million deaths, devastated the economy, and resulted in outright despair. Italy counted roughly 1.2 million dead, 3.5% of the population. About 600,000 fallen soldiers, and the same number of civilians due to wartime deprivation of food and medicine. The Great War has permanently scarred Luciano, literally, in that his leg was badly injured in combat, causing him to walk with a limp. And emotionally, in terms of the horrors he witnessed. His plans to marry were another casualty of his military service. As he tells his former fiancée, I was back from the war, but then I never came back. Although he's repeatedly hailed as a hero for killing 5 Austrian soldiers with his bayonet, he's left with mixed feelings. He fought in the Battle of Ottagara, mentioned in the film. This was a senseless bloodbath on a mountain in the Alps, which the Italians conquered in a fierce uphill hand-to-hand struggle, and then lost in the enemy's counterattack. About 10,000 troops were slaughtered. Yet the front line remained unchanged. Soldiers and civilians wondered, what was the point of such carnage? Italy was on the winning side in World War I, but it felt betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles because Britain, in order to get it to join the Allies, had promised it the Dalmatian coast. That's the seaboard across the Adriatic from Italy, today in Croatia, which had been part of the defeated Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yet that strip of strategic ports and natural beauty was instead given to the newly formed Yugoslavia. So Mussolini, in his bid for power, excoriated the country's leaders for having delivered, as he put it, a mutilated victory. After the armistice, like many other countries, Italy experienced an influenza epidemic, crippling workers' strikes, runaway inflation, failed coups d'etats, and in several big cities, short-lived, violent Soviet-style regimes. Millions of people, indignant, disillusioned, desperate, rejected the failed systems of the past in Italy's case, a 60-year-long parliamentary democracy, and instead embraced the most extreme alternatives: fascism, communism, and later Nazism. Let's look at the next slide. Mussolini ran on a platform of law and order, ending the post-war chaos, and presented himself as a uniquely qualified savior. In today's parlance, I alone can fix it. Italians were captivated by his charisma, his chest thrust out, his head thrown back to show his jutting jaw, his intense gaze, which you see in the upper right image, seems to reflect energy and tenacity. He was il duce, the Italian word for leader. Hitler, the Führer, also meaning leader, consciously imitated Mussolini's histrionic speech-making and posturing. Part of the fascination with il duce was his machismo. He was portrayed as a consummate athlete, skiing down a mountain shirtless, swimming in an icy stream, even taming a lion. Above all, he was acclaimed as a fearless warrior, sent by God, many thought, to bring back the glory and dominance of the Roman Empire. Now, in the lower right image, you can see those three slogans. The first, credere, that's believe. Obedire is obey. The last one, combattere, is to fight. Okay, we can remove that. Until the late 1930s, over a decade and a half into his rule, Italian fascism had little to say about the Jews. Mussolini never engaged in the anti-Judaism of the Catholic Church, which portrayed the Jews as Christ killers. He was an atheist and even derided the Pope on occasion. At times, he did accuse world Jewry, both of rapacious capitalism and soulless communism, but Italian Jewry, he stated publicly, was integral to the nation. Many Italian Jews embraced fascism, a much higher percentage than the population as a whole. They longed for peace and security, and also welcomed Mussolini's anti-communist and anti-Catholic convictions. 200 Jews participated in il Duce's takeover of the government, the 1922 March on Rome of 30,000 black shirts, when the king was intimidated into appointing him prime minister. Jews were fascist party leaders, office holders, financiers of the movement for 16 years, all the way to the racial laws of 1938. In no other country were Jews so entwined in such a dictatorship. Let me add, though, that during the war, Jews would also be highly represented among the anti-fascists and the partisans. Let's see the next slide. Mussolini had numerous adulterous affairs. This was an open secret that the public accepted as part of his virile personality. And the mistress he felt closest to, philosophically as well as romantically, was Margherita Sarfatti, a Jewish author and art critic from Venice. And there in the upper left, you see a biography of her. She published a glowing biography of Mussolini in 1926, which you see in the lower left. That she entitled it Dux, that's Latin for leader. Again, throwback to the Roman Empire. And then you see another edition of this in 1934. Decades after she passed away, the English translation of her last book came out, My Fault, meaning that she completely repudiated everything she had done in the 1920s and 30s to help Mussolini come to power. She served as his political advisor, and some historians say his mentor, influencing his policies for a decade and a half. He wrote her over 1,200 letters in the course of their relationship. Okay, we can remove that. Initially, many women, Jewish and Gentile, supported fascism because it promised equal suffrage. In the film, Anna serves a meal at a small reunion of locals who were present at the founding of the party back in 1919. But she boldly berates them because in practice, they didn't live up to that promise. Females were only allowed to vote in municipal elections under Mussolini and not for parliament. As it turned out, women's suffrage became moot as early as 1924, because that was the last national election held in Mussolini's Italy. In general, fascism imposed traditional roles for women and emphasized childbirth as a way to strengthen the nation. Single men were pressured to marry too, by having to pay a special annual tax if they remained bachelors. Females were discouraged from higher education by being charged higher tuition than men. In the workplace, women could not hold positions of authority over men. Yet, as I've discussed in prior talks, the European generation that came of age in the 1920s and 30s was often rebellious and turned to pursuits that had been off limits for their parents and grandparents. Let's look at the next slide. Fascism sought to incorporate that youthful exuberance and sports for females as well as males was one way to embrace modernity. And the film illustrates that with the synchronized performances on the piazza, part dance, part gymnastics. And I wanted you to see the upper image. This will give you an idea of how much attention to detail the director paid, because this archival photo is almost identical to what we see in the film, the same uniform and these same hoops. Now, these synchronized performances, one wonders if these scenes were actually made to show fascist uniformity or even callousness. Because you remember during a roller skating routine, one girl falls and is abandoned on the ground by the others. Now, in the lower image, you can see the emphasis they put on women's sports. In the 1936 Olympics, Italy came in fourth of all the countries, and they won the gold medal in women's hurdling. And there you see an image of it. Okay, we can remove that slide. Mussolini's regime was the first to be labeled totalitarian. Although I want to stress, he was not nearly as repressive as Hitler or Stalin. Still, he formed a secret police to root out enemies within, including dissenters as well as spies and saboteurs. Heinrich Himmler modeled the Gestapo after Il Duce's undercover force. And the Italian secret police had 100,000 informers. We see the harsh treatment meted out to one of Luciano's regular customers, a law professor, who tells an informer, the pro-fascist waiter, that, quote, disobeying a wrong law is sometimes an obligation. In the restaurant kitchen, we hear the cook cautioning workers who mock Mussolini for his big head. This can land you in prison, he says. Again, this is not to be compared to the Gestapo or the KGB. But Italian fascism did mean the constant fear of denunciation, one-party rule, and a lack of any independent media. Only one newspaper was permitted in the whole country, that founded and managed by Mussolini himself. Now, dissidents, including prominent authors and artists, although rarely executed, were often sent into internal exile, confined to some of the poorest and most remote villages in southern Italy. Draft dodgers like the cook were summarily taken away, as we see in the film. This regime depended on propaganda. But Mussolini faced challenges in his effort to indoctrinate the population. Unlike Hitler, his use of radio was limited because relatively few Italians owned receivers. Even by 1940, there were only 1 million sets in the country of 42 million people. The state-controlled press had a limited reach too, because almost a third of the population was illiterate. So the brainwashing centered on posters, some of them produced by the finest Italian illustrators, which I'll show you later. And by the 1930s, disinformation was spread by newsreels to bolster popular support for the government's wars abroad. There were also spectacular events, such as massive military parades. Fascism took over the public school system and attempted to permeate the entire culture, requiring the fascist salute, changing the calendar to make the 1922 March on Rome year one. And purging the Italian language of foreign loanwords. We see in the film that the French dish potage parmentière is now mestre potate. you were no longer allowed to order a croissant in a cafe. You had to ask for a cornetto. Now, for all its ridiculous trappings, some of the regime's achievements were real. Just as Hitler built the Autobahn, Mussolini constructed the Autostrada, 300 miles of motorways. In the film, Luciano praises Il Duce for public works and specifically for building over 100 new cities. This entailed draining swamps and dredging rivers, a vast project employing 125,000 men. Modern communities were then built on the reclaimed land. He also upgraded the railroad system. Although the catchphrase Mussolini made the trains run on time is a gross exaggeration. Luciano says he knows of Il Duce's accomplishments because he's seen them on newsreels. Perhaps most important, he credits Mussolini for dignifying war veterans like himself. Indeed, when they returned home in 1918, many were denigrated, even assaulted by leftists who had opposed Italy's participation and who are now vying for power. Il Duce, by contrast, valorized military service as man's highest calling. And that brought countless veterans to his side. But while Luciano voices approval of Mussolini, you can hear the ambivalence in his voice. It's as if he's trying to justify to himself the brutal bargain he's made, giving up freedom in exchange for apparent security and economic development. This unwritten social contract, giving up freedom in exchange for apparent security and economic development, this unwritten social contract became even more unpalatable by the mid-1930s, just before the film begins. With Italy's turn toward foreign aggression and colonial expansion, and its growing friendship with Nazi Germany. In 1935, Mussolini sent 200,000 troops to invade, conquer, and annex Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia. Why? Well, despite his boasts about raising the standard of living and improving the infrastructure, Italy was mired in the worldwide depression, and poverty, especially in the rural South, worsened. He needed a distraction that would boost his image as a world leader and restore Italy to its past greatness as a world power. Italy had unified, that is, become a country, relatively late, in 1861, and was thus late in acquiring colonies. Yet another source of resentment toward Britain and France, which had amassed vast empires. One of the few places in the world still open for colonization was the Horn of Africa, among the poorest regions on the globe. Let's look at the next slide. This map shows two things. in the dark red is Italy before the war, the period we're talking about. But during the war, he also invaded and occupied even more territory. So if we center here, though, on Africa, Italy actually had Libya in North Africa before Mussolini. The government before that had actually taken that as a colony. And then if we look at the Horn of Africa, just below and to the right, that pre-Mussolini government had Eritrea and Italian Somalia, so giving them a foothold on the Red Sea. Now, it had tried to connect the two, make their territory contiguous by invading and occupying Ethiopia in 1896. But surprisingly, Italy lost that war to poorly equipped African tribes, a humiliating defeat that Mussolini sought to avenge 40 years later. Now, while we have this map up, I wanted to show you other aggressions. In 1939, Mussolini invaded and essentially annexed Albania. If you see in the right across from Italy there. And then during the war, he invaded France, southeastern France, the area around Nice, which you see just to the west of Italy there. And he took over their island of Corsica. And then French Tunisia, he occupied French Tunisia and tried to penetrate Egypt, which was then under British influence. As it turned out, the British and other allies were able to drive Mussolini out of all of those territories by 1942. Okay, we can remove that now. In 1935, the Italians won in Ethiopia, defeating Emperor Haile Selassie. But to do so, they used poison gas and indiscriminately bombed civilians in hospitals and schools, killing almost 250,000 Ethiopians. Not surprisingly, Mussolini portrayed beating this weak, underdeveloped country, portrayed it as something on the level of Julius Caesar conquering half of Europe in the Gallic Wars. But Il Duce's supposed victory turned out to be a colossal blunder, because hundreds of thousands of more soldiers would be needed to occupy Ethiopia. The Italian treasury would be depleted for years to come, even when the country was involved in World War II. By the way, those gains that he made during the war that I just showed you, including Greece and the Dalmatian coast, those were only due to the help of Nazi Germany. They had to bail out the Italian army on numerous occasions during that conflict. Now, in justifying colonialism, Il Duce played the race card, framing the conflict as a crusade to bring civilization to wild savages and to defend Italian women from Black Africans. Let's look at the next slide. So these were postcards that were drawn by the artist Aurelio Bertiglia during the Italian-Ethiopian War. Now, isn't it interesting that he depicts both the Italian soldiers and the Ethiopians as children? He does that because he wants to present a kind of innocent, benign picture of Italy conquering Ethiopia. His idea here is to minimize the atrocities that were actually perpetrated there. You look at the top one, you see the Ethiopian children. They seem servile, almost slavish, almost worshipful to the Italian soldier who's come to bring them, quote unquote, civilization. Below, you see even a battle is portrayed here with the Italians kicking out Haile Selassie and the Ethiopians. Let's look at the next one. At the top, you see the children painting the Italian flag atop a giant map of Ethiopia. Even little girls here are involved in this. But there were also posters, here's one by a different artist, that were much more vivid and striking. The one on the bottom, it was captioned, "Defend her." And the Black Africans were seen as a threat to Italian women. Okay, we can remove that. By the mid-1930s, Mussolini became impressed with Hitler's growing military might. With the German annexation of Austria in 1938, March 38, Italy now had a border with the Reich. And he was worried that the Nazis might try to take over provinces in northern Italy, which contained more than 1 million ethnic Germans. After all, Hitler was menacing Czechoslovakia and Poland at this time for the same reason, to create a greater Reich. Il Duce thought an alliance with Berlin would not only neutralize this threat to his northern border, but also help him win the Dalmatian coast that you saw on the map earlier. If the Nazis, through ultimatums or war, could weaken Britain and France and forge a new geopolitical order. Both the racism unleashed in the crusade against Ethiopia and the growing alliance with Germany paved the way for the sudden, stunning anti-Semitic decrees of 1938, modeled after the infamous Nuremberg laws 3 years earlier. They defined Jews not by religion, but by race, that is, by Jewish ancestry. And thus defined, they were almost completely excluded from Italian society. Let's look at the next slide. You see these were sent out to the public using cartoon characters. This may have also been because of the high rate of illiteracy, or to somehow make this more innocent looking. But these cute figures here, all of this masks a great deal of human misery that these laws caused. Now, just to give you an idea here, I'll translate a few of these. And the first one is, on the left, is to be in military service. I know it's hard to read this, but I'll tell you what it says. The second one, they're not allowed to be tutors of Italian children. I think you see a little girl in the lower left of that image, and there's an X. Jews are not allowed to own any kind of business connected with national defense. The second row on the left, Jews are not allowed to own factories or land. And then the one right to the right of that is almost identical to one in the Nuremberg laws. Jews are not allowed to employ Aryan domestics. They had to be dismissed. The one across the bottom on the left is that foreign Jews living in Italy, that's 10,000 people, they were expelled. And they had until 1940 to leave. If they didn't, they were put into detention centers. And on the right, you have Jews are not allowed to be in civil or military administration. And the next one across, Jews are not allowed to be members of the fascist party. Recall I mentioned many Jews had been, right? And then in the next one, Jews are not allowed to be involved in any kind of municipal or civil administration. The next row is similar. Jews not allowed to be involved in unions. Jews are not that there were really powerful unions. Jews were not allowed to have any connection to banks or insurance companies. And then at the bottom, Jews are not allowed to attend Italian schools. While we have that up there, I wanted to add something that's actually not in this publication, but was quite serious. Again, modeled after the Nuremberg laws. Jews were not allowed to marry non-Jews. And the 22-year-old Giorgio Bassani, who captures the anxiety in this period in his sensitive novel, The Garden of the Finzi Continis. Bassani had to break off his engagement to his Catholic fiancée. Okay, we can remove that now. Italian Jews were incredulous at what nearly all considered a betrayal. And that applies not only to Mussolini, but also to the King of Italy and to the Pope, who were passive in the face of this draconian persecution. As so often in Jewish history, as one scholar puts it, the zenith of a community is actually its precipice. In earlier talks on the Jews of Germany and Hungary, especially Budapest, I've discussed the shock of going overnight from being a valued citizen to a pariah. But I believe the fall from grace was steepest in Italy. This community dates back to Roman times. And although it was ghettoized in the medieval period and after, it flourished during the Renaissance and received complete emancipation with the unification of 1861, 3 generations before the racial war. No group fought harder for the creation of the modern Italian state. and no group benefited from it more. Jews excelled in business. The Olivetti typewriter company is only one example. Jews were active in Italian politics as mayors of major cities, including Rome. They fought and died for Italy in World War I. During this long golden age before the racial laws, Italian Jewry engaged prominent architects to design magnificent synagogues, some exquisite little gems, others in Rome and Florence, majestic and monumental. They are highlights of any Jewish study tour to that country. Jews were prominent academics and artists, and above all, authors. They were only 0.1% of the population, yet produced 5 of Italy's greatest 20th century writers. Their rich memoirs reflected false sense of security they felt, these writers, growing up in Mussolini's Italy. For Primo Levi, being Jewish was, quote, a pleasant novelty. Dan Vittorio Segre writes that his classmates were envious of him because he was not required to attend catechism instruction, as if he had won a lottery by his Jewish birth. And as I mentioned earlier, many Jews were ultra-nationalists who joined the fascist party and rose in its ranks until the thunderbolt of 1938. How could this have happened? Naturally, many historians view it as a way to align with Nazi Germany for political reasons. Hitler's grand visit to Rome in that fateful year, 1938, is mentioned in the film. He never directly asked Mussolini to enact the racial laws, but it's clear the Nazis chafed at so many Jews in his movement, which they derided as kosher fascism. So on one level, the severe discrimination against Jews followed from the embrace of Nazi Germany. But the racist anti-Semitism in Italy was also homegrown. Its seeds planted by the subjugation of East Africans in Italy's ruthless quest to build an empire. Let's look at the next slide. Here you see some racist images, and this is also a very well-known artist, Gino Boccasile. The one on the upper left is, the African wars, as I mentioned, against the British and some of the Africans on their side against Italian occupation. And this looks like someone like a Julius Caesar, and he's saying, "They shall not prevail." The one on the right from 1943 is one of really the most repugnant racist images I've ever seen. This is a Black soldier, a sergeant in the US Army. This is after the Americans landed in Sicily and started to work their way up the peninsula. This shows that this soldier has looted Venus de Milo, and he is so ignorant that he's charging $2 to try to sell it. The same artist drew the picture below. That was also a poster at that time, a caricature of a Jew. I know it's hard to make out, but on the lower right, there's a red star as if he's a communist. but somehow he's coming out of the New York City skyline, so maybe he's also a capitalist. Hard to tell. Let's look at the next one. This to me is very, very telling. With Jews and blacks lumped together as inferior and alien to the master race. Some of the top fascist leaders, like Achille Starace, you see him there on the right, he was the head of the party in the 1930s. He was a full-fledged Jew hater, and he prodded Mussolini in that direction. Starace is mentioned in the film several times, and Giovanni the cook lampoons him as an idiot, but then has to bite his tongue. Now, Starace in 1938 founded this monthly magazine called La Difesa della Razza, the defense of the race. Look at this image closely. This shows a knife, actually, separating someone who looks like an ancient Roman from a Jewish caricature and an Ethiopian woman. I think you'll agree that in this image, which was used as a logo on the cover of every magazine that was published by La Difesa della Razza, all the way up to 1943, you'll agree this logo really shows how the racism in Africa and the racist anti-Semitism against Jews were linked together. Okay, can remove that. By the way, I know it was maybe would have been hard to see on this screen, but the date of that first issue of the magazine was not 1938, but 16. Why? Because it was the year 16 after the March on Rome of 1922. Recall what I said, they changed the calendar. Now, what was the Jewish reaction to the racial laws? To this drastic reversal of fortune, this loss of status. About 6,000, 1/8 of the community, emigrated. The refugees included the nuclear physicist Enrico Fermi, who feared for the safety of his Jewish wife. They came to the United States in 1938, the same year he won the Nobel Prize, and he later worked with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. Several of the most prominent patriotic Jews were so shattered, disoriented, that they committed suicide. A leading book publisher in the northern city of Modena walked to the top of the 300-foot-high medieval tower that was its most famous landmark and jumped off to his death, leaving a note saying he could trace his ancestry in Modena back 7 generations and was thus 7 times Italian. A few of the leading Jews who were longtime fascists, even though they were abruptly thrown out of the party, still supported Mussolini and publicly voiced their unwavering faith in him and their acceptance of the racial laws. They said that Il Duce must have had good reasons for this, and that they would get back all their rights when the crisis in Europe was over. Now, one element of the Italian Jewish community that Mussolini had always scorned was the small Zionist movement, because that raised the specter of dual loyalties in his mind. So after the racial laws were passed, a group of Jewish fascists, to prove their allegiance to the country, burned down the offices of a Zionist magazine in Florence. But that hardly changed the government's position about Jews deserving no place in Italian society. Most Jews, although distressed and outraged, tried to adapt to the new circumstances, as we see in the autobiographical novel, The Garden of the Finzi Continis. Non-Aryans are barred from the public tennis courts. So the affluent Jewish family opens their private estate, tennis courts on their private estate, to their Jewish friends. Many more got around the racial laws by bribing officials or calling in favors from people who could make exceptions, or simply eliciting the sympathy of those in charge, even strangers. The Italian authorities were far more lax in enforcing racial laws than were the Germans. Although Jews were legally barred from the universities, somehow Giorgio Bassani and Primo Levi received their degrees in 1939. Now, about 4,000 Jews, almost 10% of the community, converted to Catholicism at this time. This would not help you if you had two Jewish parents. But if you were the product of a mixed marriage, baptism could spare you. Some Jewish mothers, for the benefit of their children, swore under oath that they had been impregnated not by their Jewish husband, but rather by a non-Jew with whom they were having an affair. Thus, they claimed their sons' daughters were half Aryan. A few Jews, I know this sounds so humiliating, a few Jews actually exhumed the remains of their forebears from Jewish cemeteries and had them reinterred in Catholic burial grounds in order to disguise their ancestry. Esther Bauer, as we see in the film, takes yet a different tack. She obtains false papers and poses as a non-Jew, Anna Costanzi, and moves to a town where she will not be recognized. She is well educated, but is now unemployable, cannot attend a university. Her parents lost their fabric store and their home. Her brother was thrown out of work. Of course, she also tries to hide her identity because her husband is in the French resistance. Now, how did non-Jewish Italians react to the racial laws? A minority avidly approved. The young waiter, Corrado, balks at having to serve a decorated war veteran, an army colonel, because the man is Jewish. They are not like us, he insists. Most Italians, though, were indifferent because they were preoccupied with so many other things. The Depression, bloody colonial wars in East Africa, the looming threat of war in Europe. The Vatican went along with marginalizing the Jews, but protested that religion, not race, be the deciding factor. It spoke out only on behalf of those who had converted to Catholicism. Let me conclude with director Piccioni's main theme, the reaction of Luciano, who at first seems almost ignorant of the harsh decrees. Anna is exasperated when he says Jews aren't persecuted in Italy. But soon he sees their oppression as one of the many contradictions in the fascist movement he had supported. Whereas Mussolini promised law and order, Luciano witnesses corruption and violence. His restaurant, his sanctuary, is invaded by the secret police. Instead of prosperity, there's poverty. Instead of peace, there is needless war. Exactly what had broken him 20 years earlier. He finally sees through the propaganda and tells even the local party boss that the invasion of Greece is not going well. But most of all, he comes to his senses through the plight of individuals, the professor, the cook, and above all, Anna and her husband. Luciano, long a fascist, will risk his life harboring two fugitives wanted by the regime. In the end, the film shows how the personal can reshape the political, how being in close touch with those who are suffering injustice can completely change one's attitude and behavior. And beyond witnessing their pain, Luciano sees the young couple resisting evil. We don't know what path he will take after Anna's departure, but we know he's no longer passive in the face of tyranny. Thank you.